This video is about how to study the endgame, and to study the endgame you first have to understand what the endgame is. And often when people talk about endgames they just assume that any position without queens is an endgame. It's probably better to define endgames as positions where a king can play an active role. If you advance the king to the center and it gets attacked and checkmated, it's probably not an endgame, even if the queens are off the board. And it's really difficult sometimes to sense whether the endgame has started or not. In many cases, there's no such thing as theory of endgames, and the theory of endgames mostly applies to cases where it's only a bishop against a rook or rook against rook and so on. So in more complicated positions, which are still endgames, there's no theory per se. It's useful to use the term of simple positions, and simple positions are those where there's a minor piece and the rook. So in this game I'll show an example of a simple position like that, where there are rooks and the bishops of opposite color. This is an example from my own game, which I played many years ago when I was a junior chess player. I was playing with the white pieces, and my position was slightly worse, but I didn't quite sense the danger of that position, and initially I was quite surprised that my opponent didn't offer a draw here. The slight problem is the slight problem about white's position is that black's bishop is more active, whereas the white bishop is pretty much shut down by his own pawns. So white has to play a little bit carefully here. With this move, black highlights the other strength of his position, which is the open files. So he can attack my pawns with his rooks along the c file and the a file. So black has transferred his rook to an active position on a5 and is now putting pressure on my pawn on a2. So I rushed a little bit with a freeing move, and as a result I ended up in a difficult position. Here white should probably have played a rook to d3 and then transfer that rook to b3, put pressure on the b4 pawn, and then only later advance the pawn to a3 or to a4. I rushed with a4 immediately, and that just created weaknesses in my position. So now the a3 pawn is kind of vulnerable, and what's also quite unfortunate is that the black rook becomes very active and invades into my position along the b file. So this move highlights the flaws of my position. Now black wants to play pawn to a4 and either force my rook to retreat along the third rank, or black is just going to win the a3 pawn. And what's also bad is that when the pawn advances to a4, the black pawn, then the white pawn on a3 is going to get even weaker, and black can eventually transfer the bishop, say, to c1, attack it twice, and win that pawn. So black begins to transfer the bishop to c1, and white just doesn't have any counterplay whatsoever. So white's position is already very, very difficult here. This endgame is mostly instructive, not because of the good moves that the players played, but mostly because of the mistakes that we made. Here, black could have used the fact that this is pretty much an endgame, and his king can play an active role in this position, and he could probably win this game quite easily by advancing the king through f6 to e5 and then attacking the bishop on e4 and the pawn on d5, and the king could play a very important role in this position. But instead he just decided that he has a plan of winning the a pawn, and anything to distract him from that plan is probably unnecessary. So he shut down the king side with f6, but it was much better to play king to f6 and advance the king to e5. I was probably trying to prevent bishop c1, but this just ends up giving up the a3 pawn immediately. Black begins to transfer the king to the queen side, where he can either attack the d5 pawn or help the rook to promote the a3 pawn. Black is threatening with pawn to a2, and then if white gives check rook a8, then just rook a5 is going to block the a file, and black's going to promote the pawn. This is the only move because it frees up the c2 square for the white bishop. So I managed to win the a3 pawn, but on the other hand, black has won the pawn on d5, and now he has two connected passed pawns in the center. The position, of course, should be lost for white because two passed pawns is basically too much to handle. The only chance that white has in this position is to exchange the pair of rooks, because then white would be able to set up the blockade on the dark squares and use that property of the endings with the bishops of opposite colors, which often lead to a draw. At this point, black's position is completely winning. The only thing that's stopping the c3 pawn from promoting is the bishop on c2, so black could attack it with something like rook to e5, rook e1 check, and then rook c1, or black can just improve the position of the king. So black probably just thought that the easiest way to get rid of that bishop is to play rook b5 and then rook b2 and just attack the bishop, and he made the worst possible mistake he could have made in this position. So just as I was surprised that my opponent didn't agree to a draw and try to find some advantage throughout this endgame, at this point I was just as surprised that he allowed me to exchange rooks. In some sense, he might have just relaxed a little bit too much and didn't see my next move. But I think it's also possible, based on his play in the next few moves, was that he was also convinced that the endgame with the rooks off the board is also going to be winning for him, because while he has two extra pawns, like one of them is about to promote, and it seems like black's position is winning anyway. At this point I had only 2 or 3 minutes on my clock until the end of the game, and I basically could not believe my luck. With the exchange of rooks, white's defense becomes very simple. I have to simply put my king on d3 or just watch the d3 square with my king and bishop, and I have to make sure that black does not advance his king to attack my g4 pawn. And besides that, I have a complete fortress, and it's really impossible for black to go through the light squares. This prevents king to e4. Once again, the only threat that black could possibly have is to win the g4 pawn, but it's very easy to prevent that. And the black bishop in this position is pretty much completely useless, because it can't attack any one of my pawns, it can't move, it can't attack my pieces either, so it's just sitting there like a pawn that actually can promote. So white has established a fortress, and the game ended as a draw within about 20 or 30 moves that my opponent still wanted to make, just trying to see if I make a mistake. It's impossible for black to break through to the g4 pawn. He can't advance his c and d pawns. Advancing the king to b2 is not going to do anything, because I'm just going to put the king on d3, and the bishop will stay on the a4 d1 diagonal. So it's pretty much a dead draw. This game showed a few very interesting things to me, that in endgames with rooks and bishops of opposite color, initiative and the role of the rook are very important. If the rook is active, then it can be used to win pawns and create winning advantages. In the positions with only the bishops left on the board, it's pretty hard to break through, and even a material advantage such as 2 pawns is very often not enough for a win, especially if the opponent manages to set up the blockade on the squares different from the color of a bishop. So here black has a dark squared bishop, and white set up the blockade on the light squares, and there's no way to break through for black.